Hello, it's good to have you here. If you enjoy thrilling romances, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any stories. The sun over the Arizona Territory in the summer of 1888 was a merciless tyrant. It bleached the sky to a pale, hazy blue and baked the earth until it fractured into a mosaic of cracks, each one a thirsty mouth gaping at a heaven that offered no relief. The grass, once a sea of green that swayed with the wind, was now a brittle, yellow whisper. Even the stoic saguaros seemed to slump, their green skins dusted with the fine red powder that was once fertile soil. For Arthur, the land was both his lifeblood and his adversary. At 35, his face was already a map of his struggles, etched with lines of worry around eyes the color of that same unforgiving sky. His hands, thick and calloused from years of gripping reins, mending fences, and coaxing life from the stubborn ground, were rarely still. He moved with the quiet deliberation of a man who conserves his energy because he knows there is never enough to spare. His ranch, a modest spread of a few hundred acres bordering Apache lands, was all he had left. It was the legacy he had built with his late wife, Sarah, and now it was a monument to his solitude. The drought had taken its toll. The creek that bisected his property had dwindled to a muddy trickle, and he'd lost a dozen head of cattle in the last month alone, their gaunt carcasses a grim testament to the land's failing generosity. He knew his neighbors were faring no better. Men like Cornelius, whose sprawling ranch dwarfed Arthur's, were growing louder in their anger, their gazes turning more and more toward the Apache territory, where they imagined hidden springs and plentiful game. Their talk was of force, of taking what they needed, and it was a dangerous spark in a landscape made of tinder. Arthur didn't share their hatred. He saw the Apache not as savages, but as fellow survivors on a harsh and unforgiving land. He had seen their hunting parties, smaller and more desperate than in years past. He knew the drought was not a selective affliction, it was a plague upon them all. War was not a solution. It was a final, desperate act of mutual destruction. He was mending a fence near the western ridge of his property, the rhythmic strike of his hammer the only sound in the vast silence, when he saw them. 3 riders, silhouetted against the morning sun. They did not ride like cowboys or settlers. They sat their horses with a fluid grace, as one with the animals beneath them. Apache. They held their position on the ridge, a silent, unmoving watch. Arthur's hand went instinctively to the Winchester leaning against the fence post, but he made no move to raise it. This was not a raid. This was a parley. He slowly set down his hammer, wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his wrist, and waited. After a long moment, one of the riders began a slow descent toward him. Arthur recognized him instantly. It was Hotar, the chief of the local tribe. An old man, his face a testament to seasons of sun and sorrow, but his back was still straight, his dignity an unbreachable fortress. Arthur stood his ground, his stance neutral, showing his empty hands. He had traded with Hotar in the past, in better seasons, and had always found him to be a man of his word. But these were not better seasons. Hotar reined his horse to a halt a respectful distance away. His 2 warriors remained on the ridge, their vigilance a palpable force. "Arthur," the chief said. His voice was raspy, like stones grinding together, but his English was deliberate and clear. "Hotar," Arthur replied, giving a slight nod. "It has been a long time." "The land is thirsty," Hotar stated, not as a greeting but as a shared truth that needed no preamble. "The deer are thin, the rivers weep dust." "I know it," Arthur said. "My cattle fall where they stand." A heavy silence fell between them, filled only by the buzzing of a lone fly. Hotar's dark, deep-set eyes scanned Arthur's face, searching for something Arthur couldn't name. "The white men with many cows, their hearts are hot," Hotar continued. "They look at our land. They say the Apache have hidden water. They say we steal their game." "Some men are fools blinded by their own fear," Arthur said, thinking of Cornelius's blustering threats at the last town meeting. "Fear makes a man a wolf," Hotar agreed, "and wolves hunt in packs. There will be blood on this land. Your blood, my blood. It will do nothing but salt the earth so that nothing may ever grow again." Arthur knew the old chief spoke the truth. The tension had been simmering for months, and it was about to boil over. A stolen horse, a stray gunshot. It would take next to nothing to ignite a war that would consume them all. "What do you propose, Hotar?" Arthur asked, his voice low. Hotar was silent for a long moment, his gaze drifting over Arthur's small, lonely cabin in the distance. He looked back at Arthur, and for the first time Arthur saw not just a chief but a father. his eyes clouded with a profound and terrible pain. "An alliance," Hota said. "A peace, not one written on the white man's paper to be torn or forgotten. A peace bound by flesh and spirit, an old way from a time when a man's honor was his bond." Arthur's brow furrowed. He didn't understand. "What kind of alliance?" Hota took a deep breath, the sound of it a painful rasp in the dry air. "I have a daughter. Her name is Running Deer. She is the last child of my bloodline. She is proud and strong. She knows the ways of the earth and the songs of our people. Her heart is a wild thing." He paused, and his next words struck Arthur with the force of a physical blow. "I will give her to you, as your wife." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The sun felt hotter, the air thinner. Arthur stared at the chief, certain he had misheard. "Your daughter? As my wife?" he stammered. "Hota, that's impossible. We are different people. Our worlds are about to burn together," Hota interrupted, his voice gaining a hard, desperate edge. "Your marriage to my daughter will be a shield. When Cornelius and his men see the chief's daughter in your home, they will not dare attack your ranch. They will not dare cross into our lands, for to attack you would be to attack us, and to attack us would be to attack you. It will bind us. My people will have access to the lower creek, and in return my warriors will help protect your herds from predators, both four-legged and two. This union will be the root from which a new peace grows." Arthur was speechless. He thought of Sarah, of the love they had shared in that small cabin. The idea of replacing her, of taking another woman into his home, a stranger, a girl he'd never met, from a world he didn't understand, was a violation. But then he looked past Hota, at the parched, dying land. He thought of the angry, fearful faces of his neighbors and the quiet, starving dignity of the Apache. Hota was not offering a bride. He was offering a sacrifice. He was willing to give up his only child, the heart of his life, to save his people. It was a gesture of such immense weight and desperation that Arthur felt humbled. To refuse would be to condemn them all. It would be a declaration that peace was impossible, that the only answer was the rifle and the arrow. He looked at Hota's ancient, pleading eyes and saw the terrible cost of this offer. Slowly, painfully, Arthur nodded. I accept the burden," he said, the words feeling heavy and foreign on his tongue. He chose the word burden deliberately. This was not a gift. It was a responsibility of the highest order. Relief, so profound it was almost indistinguishable from grief, washed over Hota's features. He nodded once, a gesture of finality. "She will be brought to you at sundown." Without another word, he turned his horse and rode back up the ridge to his waiting warriors. They watched Arthur for a moment longer, before melting back into the landscape from which they came, leaving Arthur alone with the echo of a promise that would irrevocably alter the course of his life. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Arthur went through the motions of his chores, but his mind was a whirlwind. He was going to have a wife, an Apache wife, a girl young enough to be, well, she was a girl, and he was a man worn down by grief and hardship. What would he say to her? How could they possibly live under the same roof, two people who did not share a language, a culture, or a single memory? As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, he saw them coming, a small procession of 5 riders. Hota was at the lead. Beside him rode a figure on a dappled pony. Even from a distance he could see she was small, her back ramrod straight. They stopped at the edge of his yard. Arthur walked out onto his porch, his heart pounding a slow, heavy drum against his ribs. The riders dismounted. Hota led the girl forward. As she stepped into the fading light, Arthur felt the breath catch in his throat. She was younger than he had imagined, perhaps 20 at most. Her hair, black as a raven's wing, was woven into 2 thick braids that fell over her shoulders. She wore a simple dress of finely tanned doeskin, adorned with intricate beadwork at the collar and sleeves. But it was her face that captured him. It was a mask of stoic pride, her chin held high, but her eyes held the dark, ancient fire of her people. They were filled with a maelstrom of emotions, fear, anger, and a fierce, defiant determination that told him she was no meek, sacrificial lamb. This was Running Deer. Hota spoke to her in their native tongue, his voice soft and low. She did not look at him, keeping her gaze fixed on a point somewhere over Arthur's shoulder. She gave no reply. Then Hota turned to Arthur. "She is now of your house. Protect her, and you protect the peace between our peoples." He placed the reins of her pony in Arthur's hand. The leather was warm. Arthur's fingers brushed against hers as he took it, and she flinched, pulling her hand away as if burned. Hotar looked at his daughter one last time, his face an unreadable mask of sorrow. Then he and his warriors mounted their horses. They turned and rode away, not looking back, swallowed by the encroaching shadows of the night. Arthur was left standing in the dust, holding the reins of a horse belonging to a woman who was now his wife. Running Deer finally lowered her gaze to meet his. In her dark eyes he saw no welcome, no acceptance. He saw a stranger, a captive, and an enemy. The silence between them was as vast and empty as the desert night descending around them. The first night had begun. The inside of Arthur's cabin was a world contained in 4 wooden walls, and to Running Deer it felt like a cage. The air was thick with scents she could not place. The metallic tang of the cast-iron stove, the faint smell of soap, the lingering aroma of coffee and cured meat, and underneath it all the solitary scent of the man himself, sweat, dust, and something akin to loneliness. It was a stark contrast to the open air of her people's wickiups, which smelled of willow branches, animal hides, and the ever-present smoke of a living fire. Here the smoke was trapped, the air stagnant. Arthur felt the small space shrink with her presence. Every familiar object, the worn armchair where he read by the lantern, the row of tin plates on the shelf, the simple wooden bed in the corner, seemed alien and scrutinized under her silent gaze. The silence was a living thing between them, heavy and suffocating. He was a man of few words on his best day, but now he found he had none at all. What could he say? Welcome felt like a lie. I'm sorry felt inadequate. He made a clumsy gesture toward the table. On it was a plate with a few strips of dried beef and a hard biscuit. It was his own supper, but he pushed it toward her. An offering, a basic act of hospitality. Running Deer looked at the food, then back at him. Her face remained an impassive mask, but her eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. To her, this was the food of a man who fought the land, instead of listening to it. It was dry, lifeless. She was used to fresh meat when the hunt was good, or roasted agave hearts and mesquite beans when it was not. She gave the slightest shake of her head. Arthur's shoulders slumped a little. He felt a flush of frustration, and then shame. Of course she wouldn't eat it. He was her captor, and this was prison food. He pointed toward a small alcove at the far end of the room, where a simple cot was made up with a clean but threadbare blanket. "That is for you," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. She understood the gesture, if not the words. She walked to the cot, her moccasins making no sound on the wooden floorboards, and sat on the edge, her back as straight as a spear shaft. She did not look at him again, but stared at the rough-hewn wall as if she could see the vast starry plains through it. She was in his home, but she was a world away. Defeated, Arthur took a blanket and went outside to the porch. He couldn't bear the suffocating silence in the cabin. He would sleep outside, as he often did on warm nights. At least out here, under the open sky, he could breathe. He settled into a chair, his Winchester rifle resting against the wall beside him, and watched the moon climb higher, a silver coin in a sea of black velvet. He wondered what she was thinking, sitting in that dark room. Was she weeping for the life she had lost? Or was she plotting his demise? He did not know, and the not knowing was a cold knot in his gut. Hours passed. The world fell into a deep, primal quiet, punctuated only by the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. Arthur must have dozed off, his head slumped against the hard porch post, when a new sound ripped through the night. It was the frantic, terrified bleating of a goat from the small corral near the barn, followed by a sound that made the hair on his arms stand on end. A low, guttural snarl that was part cough, part scream. A predator's call. Mountain lion. In an instant, Arthur was on his feet, his exhaustion forgotten, replaced by a surge of adrenaline. He snatched his rifle. That goat was one of his last 3 milk producers. He couldn't afford to lose another animal. He moved quickly and silently off the porch, using the shadows of the moon as cover as he crept toward the corral. The bleating grew more desperate. As he rounded the corner of the barn, he saw it. A sleek, muscular shape low to the ground, its tawny coat almost invisible in the gloom. The puma was stalking the cornered goat, its long tail twitching in anticipation. It was a large male, gaunt from the drought, which made it bolder and more dangerous than usual. Arthur raised the rifle to his shoulder, trying to get a clean shot in the poor light. But shooting now was risky. A missed or wounded shot would only enrage the beast, and in the ensuing chaos he could lose the entire herd. He needed to get closer. Suddenly, A soft footfall behind him made him spin around, his heart leaping into his throat. It was Running Deer. She had emerged from the cabin, a dark silhouette against the lantern light spilling from the open doorway. She carried nothing, her hands empty at her sides. "Get back inside," Arthur hissed, his voice a harsh whisper. "It's not safe." She ignored him. Her eyes were fixed on the puma, not with fear but with an intense analytical focus. He expected her to scream, to run, to be a liability he would have to protect. Instead, she bent down, her movements fluid and silent, and picked up a handful of small stones from the ground. Before Arthur could comprehend her intent, she took a step to his left, away from the direct line between him and the cat. Her first stone arced through the air, not at the puma but at the far wall of the barn, striking the wood with a sharp clack. The puma's head whipped toward the sound, its ears swiveling, momentarily distracted from its prey. Then Running Deer did something that froze Arthur's blood. She cupped her hands around her mouth and let out a sound, a sharp, barking cry, followed by a low growl that was a surprisingly accurate imitation of a territorial coyote. It was a sound of challenge, a sound of another predator laying claim to this territory. The puma was utterly confused. Its hunt was interrupted. Its senses were now screaming at it about a potential threat from an unseen direction. It let out a frustrated snarl, its gaze darting from the goat to the spot where the stone hit, to the darkness where the coyote-like challenge had come from. The goat, sensing its chance, scrambled to the other side of the pen. The moment of confusion was all Arthur needed. The puma was now broadside to him, its attention diverted. He had a clear shot, but as he looked at the magnificent, confused animal, he didn't feel the urge to kill. He felt a pang of pity for a fellow creature struggling to survive in a dying land. He lowered the barrel of the Winchester slightly and fired into the dirt a few feet in front of the cat. The rifle's roar shattered the night. Dirt and gravel kicked up, stinging the puma's face. The combination of the confusing sounds, the sudden flash of light, and the deafening blast was too much. With a final angry hiss, the great cat turned and bounded away, disappearing into the darkness with astonishing speed. The silence that rushed back in was profound. The goat was whimpering in the corner of the corral, but otherwise, all was still. Slowly, Arthur lowered his rifle, his knuckles white. He turned to look at Running Deer. She stood bathed in the pale moonlight, her head held high, her expression calm. She was no longer just the chief's daughter, the symbol of a treaty he had been forced to accept. In that moment, she was something more. She was a survivor, a huntress. She had faced down one of the land's most fearsome predators with nothing but her wits and a few pebbles. He had expected to have to protect her. Instead, she had helped him. She had understood the animal, its instincts and its fears, in a way he never could. Their eyes met across the dusty yard. For the first time, the wall of anger and fear between them seemed to crumble. He saw in her eyes not a captive, but a woman of immense courage and wisdom, and in his, she saw not an enemy, a white man who had taken her from her home, but a man vulnerable, fiercely protective of his land, a man who, like her, was simply trying to hold on in a world that was falling apart. No words were spoken, none were needed. The language of mutual respect is universal. The terror of the night had forged a new, fragile understanding. Together they turned and walked back toward the small cabin. The space no longer felt like a cage or a prison. It felt for the first time like a shelter, a shared shelter, against the roaring darkness of the world outside. The night had changed everything. The weeks that followed the incident with the mountain lion were marked by a quiet, cautious rhythm. The chasm of silence between Arthur and Running Deer remained, but it was no longer filled with hostility. Instead, it became a space of observation. They learned each other's habits through shared proximity, building a language without words. Arthur learned that she rose with the first hint of dawn, moving with a silent grace that made the creaking floorboards of the cabin hold their breath. He would often wake to find a small bundle of herbs or edible roots on the table, things she had foraged from the seemingly barren land. Things he had never known were there. One morning, he watched from the barn as she cut a piece from a barrel cactus, expertly stripped the spines, and squeezed the pulp to produce a trickle of life-giving water, a secret of the desert he had never learned. In turn, Running Deer learned the cadence of his labor. She watched the methodical way he repaired his tools, the gentle but firm hands he used on his remaining livestock, and the deep lines of exhaustion that settled on his face as he sat by the lantern light each evening, cleaning his rifle or mending a piece of tack. She saw that he was a man wedded not to a woman, but to this harsh piece of earth, a union that demanded every ounce of his strength. He never forced her to speak, never made an unwelcome advance, and always left her the first portion of whatever meager food was available. It was a respect she had not expected. The fragile peace they had built within the four walls of the cabin, however, was a bubble in a boiling pot. The world outside had not forgotten the arrangement that brought them together, and it did not approve. The first sign of the coming storm came when Arthur rode into the small dusty settlement of Redemption for supplies. As he tied his horse to the hitching post outside the general store, he felt the change. Men who once offered a curt nod now turned their backs. The whispers followed him like flies. He entered the store and the low hum of conversation ceased. Cornelius was there, leaning against the counter, a smug look on his fleshy face. He was a big man running to fat, with small suspicious eyes that missed nothing. "Well, look what the wind blew in," Cornelius drawled, loud enough for the entire store to hear. "If it ain't the Apache's new son-in-law." A few men snickered. Arthur ignored him, handing his list to the storekeeper. "Heard you're sharing your bed with a redskin now, Arthur," Cornelius pressed on, stepping closer. "You best be careful. A man lies down with a snake. He's bound to get bit." "How do you know she ain't just counting your guns and cattle for her daddy's war party?" Arthur's jaw tightened. He turned slowly, his blue eyes as cold as a winter morning. "That's my wife you're talking about, Cornelius." "Wife?" Cornelius barked out a laugh. "You call that a wife? That's a truce bought and paid for. A truce that ain't worth the spit to seal it. While you're playing house, the rest of us are losing livestock. Our wells are going dry. But I hear old Hotar's camp still has water. Funny, ain't it?" "The drought is hitting everyone," Arthur said, his voice dangerously low. "Even you, Cornelius, can't blame the Apache for the lack of rain." "Can't I?" Cornelius sneered, his face reddening. "We'll see who's to blame when things get desperate enough." Arthur collected his supplies, paid the silent storekeeper, and left without another word. The ride home was heavy with a sense of foreboding. Cornelius's words were not just the ramblings of a bitter man. They were seeds of poison being planted in the minds of desperate settlers. His fears were realized 2 days later. He went to the creek, the one that served as the primary water source for his ranch, and further downstream for Hotar's people. The flow, already weak, had been reduced to a damp smear of mud. Arthur's heart sank. He followed the creek bed upstream, his boots sinking into the wet earth. A mile north, just beyond the edge of his property, he found the cause. A crudely built dam of rocks and logs had been erected, diverting what little water remained into a ditch that flowed west toward Cornelius's vast ranch. It was a deliberate act of war. It was meant to strangle both him and the Apache, to create the very desperation Cornelius had spoken of. He stood there for a long time, the silence of the dry creek bed roaring in his ears. He returned to the cabin to find Running Deer waiting by the door. She held a clay pot, and her eyes were fixed on the northern hills. She had already sensed the water was gone. Their gazes met, and in that moment they were no longer a settler and an Apache. They were two people staring down a common, ruthless enemy. The second blow fell the very next day. A pair of riders from Cornelius's ranch galloped into his yard, their horses kicking up dust, their faces flushed with righteous anger. "Arthur!" one of them shouted, reining his horse to a skidding halt. "We know what you did!" Arthur came out onto the porch, his rifle held loosely in his hand. Running Deer watched from the shadows of the doorway. "My prize stallion is gone!" the man yelled, pointing a trembling finger at the cabin. "Stolen from my stables last night. Apache tracks all over the place. It was her. She told them where to find my best horse." Arthur's blood ran cold. He knew Running Deer hadn't left the cabin, but he also knew the accusation was a lit match thrown into a powder keg. This was the excuse Cornelius needed. "You're mistaken," Arthur said, his voice steady. "She's been here all night." "Liar!" the second man spat. "You're in it with them. You let your squaw signal her warriors. We're coming back, Arthur, and we're getting that horse back one way or another." They wheeled their horses and galloped off, leaving a cloud of dust and threats hanging in the air. Arthur turned and looked at Running Deer. For the first time since she had arrived, her mask of stoic pride had cracked. He saw a flicker of genuine fear in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a deep, burning anger. She knew who was responsible. He could see it in the way her fists clenched at her sides. It was not her father's doing. This was the work of a rogue element, someone whose pride was more important than peace. She thought of Mato, the young warrior whose eyes burned with resentment when she left the camp. He was rash, and his hatred for the white settlers was a fire that could not be controlled. He had broken the treaty. He had betrayed them all. She was trapped. Her own people's recklessness had just confirmed every suspicion the settlers had about her, and Arthur, the man who had offered her a grudging respect, was now in danger because of her. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon when they came. It wasn't just 2 riders this time. It was a group of nearly a dozen men, led by Cornelius, all armed with rifles. They formed a grim, silent line at the edge of his property, the setting sun glinting off their gun barrels. They were a posse, a lynch mob. Arthur stood on his porch, his Winchester held at his side. Running Deer was inside the cabin, but he knew she was watching from the window. "This is your last chance, Arthur," Cornelius called out, his voice booming across the yard. "We know she's the spy. She directed the raid. Hand her over to us. Renounce this sham of a treaty and ride with us. We're going to teach those savages a lesson and take back what's ours. Are you with us or are you with them?" The choice was laid bare. His people or this strange, silent woman who had been forced upon him, his safety or his honor. He thought of the quiet courage she had shown against the puma. He thought of the herbs she left on his table. He thought of the dam that was choking the life out of this land, a crime committed not by the Apache, but by the very man who now claimed to be seeking justice. He took a step forward, positioning himself squarely in front of the cabin door. He was no longer just a man on a porch. He was a barrier. He raised his voice, clear and unwavering, so every man could hear. "There's no them. There is only my wife. You're not welcome on my land. Turn around and ride away." A murmur of shock and anger went through the posse. Cornelius's face contorted with rage. From inside the cabin, Running Deer heard his words. My wife. He hadn't said it with love or even affection, but with a raw, defiant sense of possession and protection. He had chosen. He had drawn a line in the dust and placed himself on her side of it, against the entire world. Cornelius's face purpled with rage. Arthur's defiance was a public challenge he could not ignore. "You've made your choice then," he snarled, raising his rifle. "You're no better than them." The line of men tensed, fingers tightening on triggers. The air grew thick with the metallic taste of impending violence. Arthur stood his ground, a lone figure against a dozen guns, his own Winchester held ready but not aimed. He wasn't trying to win a gunfight. He was trying to prevent one. But before Cornelius could give the order to fire, a movement from the cabin doorway drew every eye. Running Deer stepped out onto the porch, moving to stand beside Arthur. She was unarmed, her hands held open at her sides in a gesture that was both vulnerable and fearless. She did not look at the armed men. Instead, she looked at Arthur, and in that simple public act of solidarity, she doubled his strength. She was no longer a woman hiding behind him, but a partner standing with him. Her presence shifted the dynamic. The men had come to punish a savage and a traitor. What they saw now was a man and his wife standing together to defend their home. For some of the posse, men who were merely followers caught up in Cornelius's anger, the image struck a chord of doubt. This was not as simple as they had been led to believe. "This is between me and Arthur," Cornelius bellowed, unnerved by her appearance. "Get your squaw back inside." Arthur didn't even glance at her. "She stays," he said, his voice flat and final. "This is her home." The standoff held for another tense minute. The silence stretched taut like a wire. Finally, one of the ranchers lowered his rifle slightly. "Cornelius," he muttered, "this ain't right. We ain't here to make war on a man's home." The spell was broken. Others murmured in agreement. Their anger had been directed at a faceless Apache threat, not at a neighbor, even a misguided one, standing on his own porch. Cornelius, seeing his support crumble, let out a frustrated roar. "You're all fools. He's betrayed us. When they come for your cattle and your families, remember this day." He glared at Arthur one last time, a look of pure hatred, before wheeling his horse around and riding off in a cloud of impotent fury. The other men hesitated. Then slowly, one by one, they followed, their righteous crusade dissolving into a shame-faced retreat. When the last rider had disappeared over the rise, Arthur finally allowed himself to breathe. He lowered his rifle, the tension draining out of him, leaving a profound weariness in its place. He turned to Running Deer. The porch, which had felt like a battlefield moments before, was now just a small wooden space under the setting sun. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling small for what she had done. She met his gaze, and for the first time, she initiated their communication. She pointed a finger toward the north in the direction Cornelius had built the dam. Then she made a gesture with her hands, like water flowing, and then pinched it off to a stop. She looked at him, her eyes asking if he understood. He nodded slowly. Yes, the water. He stopped it. Then she surprised him again. She pointed to the east, toward Cornelius's ranch, and mimicked a horse galloping. After that, she pointed south, toward her people's territory. She shook her head fiercely, then tapped her own chest. Her meaning was clear. The horse, it was not my people's doing. Not the tribe. Arthur's mind raced. A warrior? He asked, trying to find a word she might know. One man? She nodded, her expression grim. She spoke a name, the sound sharp and guttural. Matto. Then she drew a line in the air between Cornelius's ranch and her camp, a clear path of provocation. She saw the whole picture. Matto's foolish pride had given Cornelius the perfect excuse to rally the ranchers and attack her weakened camp, not for a horse, but for the land and the water he believed was hidden there. It all clicked into place. This wasn't a series of unfortunate events. It was a trap, and they were caught in the middle. He means to attack your camp, Arthur said, thinking aloud. He'll use the stolen horse as the reason. Running Deer nodded again, her eyes dark with urgency. They were out of time. They had to act now, together. He saw the intelligence and strategic thinking in her gaze and realized he had never been more wrong about another person in his life. He had seen a captive. He should have seen a queen. We need to warn them, he said, and we need to expose Cornelius. A plan began to form in his mind, desperate and dangerous. Your father, will he listen to me? She paused, then gave a single, decisive nod. She would make him listen. All right, Arthur said, a new resolve hardening his voice. Get your pony, we ride. They did not take the main trail. Running Deer led him along a narrow, hidden path through the rocky mesas that she knew from a lifetime of exploring this land. It was a treacherous route that cut the travel time to her camp by half. They rode in silence, two figures moving as one through the twilight, their shared purpose a silent bond between them. They arrived at the edge of the Apache camp. As the last light faded from the sky, it was smaller and more subdued than Arthur had imagined. The faces of the people gaunt with hunger. Two warriors with bows materialized from the shadows, their expressions hostile as they saw Arthur. But Running Deer spoke to them in her language, her voice ringing with an authority they had never heard from her before. After a moment's hesitation, they lowered their weapons and led them to the center of the camp, where a small fire burned in front of Hotar's wickiup. The old chief emerged, his face a mask of weary surprise. When he saw Arthur, his hand went to the knife at his belt. Running Deer stepped forward, placing herself between the two men. She began to speak, her voice flowing with the cadence of her native tongue. She spoke of the dam, of Cornelius's lies, and of Matto's reckless act of theft that had endangered them all. She spoke of Arthur, not as her white husband, but as a man of honor who had stood against his own people to protect her, a man who had come not to conquer but to warn. As she spoke, Matto himself pushed through the crowd, his face a storm of anger and denial. She lies. She speaks with the forked tongue of the white man she now serves. He has poisoned her mind. Hotar looked from Matto's furious face to his daughter's steady gaze, and then to Arthur, who stood silently, allowing Running Deer to be his voice. He saw no poison in her, only a newfound strength. He saw no deceit in Arthur, only a grim determination. Is it true, Matto? Hotar asked, his voice low and dangerous. Did you take the rancher's horse? Matto's defiance crumbled under the chief's piercing stare. It was an insult that she was given away, he spat. Our honor had to be restored. Your pride is not our honor, Hotar said, his voice like cracking stone. Your pride has brought the wolf to our door. He turned to his warriors. Bring the horse, it will be returned with our apologies. Then he looked at Arthur. My daughter speaks the truth. You have kept your end of the bargain. You have protected her. The bargain was for peace, Arthur replied, his voice firm. Cornelius means to break it tonight. We need to stop him. While the horse was being retrieved, Arthur explained his plan. He and Running Deer rode back under the cover of darkness, not to his ranch, but to the illegal dam. With the help of two of Hotar's trusted warriors, they worked quickly, prying loose the key logs at the base of the structure. The dam groaned, and then, with a sudden roar, it gave way. A torrent of pent-up water surged down the dry creek bed, a powerful, undeniable announcement that the flow had been deliberately tampered with. It was a message that would reach Arthur's ranch and the other downstream ranches by dawn. By the time the sun rose, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold, Arthur and Running Deer were back on their own porch, watching as the creek began to swell with muddy, life-giving water. An hour later, two of Hotar's warriors returned Cornelius's prized stallion, leaving it tied to the fence post before melting back into the hills. The story unraveled quickly after that. The sudden rush of water confirmed Arthur's claims of sabotage. The return of the horse, unharmed, proved the Apache tribe's desire for peace. Cornelius's web of lies fell apart, his support among the other ranchers evaporating. He was left isolated, exposed as a greedy man willing to start a war for his own gain. The immediate threat was gone. Arthur and Running Deer stood together on the porch, watching the morning light wash over their land. The air felt different, cleaner, a true peace, born not of a desperate treaty but of mutual trust and shared struggle, had settled over the valley. Running Deer turned to him. She reached out and lightly touched the worn fabric of his shirt sleeve. It was the first time she had initiated physical contact. "Arthur," she said, testing his name on her tongue. It was one of the few English words he had heard her speak. He looked down at her, at the woman who was his wife. The chasm between their worlds had not vanished, but they had built a bridge across it. A bridge forged in moonlight and danger, cemented with honor and trust. He saw a future in her eyes, one he had never thought possible. A future of quiet mornings, shared burdens, and a strength that neither of them possessed alone. He reached out and gently took her hand. Her fingers, small and strong, curled around his. They didn't need words. They stood there for a long time, hand in hand, as the sun climbed higher, watching the water flow freely in the creek below. They were home. True peace is not a contract signed in desperation, but a bridge built with trust, courage, and the willingness to see the humanity in another, even across the deepest cultural divides. It is forged not in council rooms, but in shared moments of vulnerability and mutual defense. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to confirm your subscription and leave a like. It helps us a lot.